Hi, this is our video on the Psychoanalysis of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley.
Here is a list of topics that we will be discussing throughout the video. They are
a timeline of attitudes towards mental illness and how they correspond to the text,
Mary Shelley's relationship to mental health and how this impacted the novel,
the science versus religion argument,
Freud's theories on the structure of personality with the id, ego and superego,
the Oedipus complex,
the use of defense mechanisms,
isolation and mental health,
analysis of the structure, language and form used in Frankenstein,
critics' quotes on the psychoanalysis of Frankenstein,
and an example of an essay answer analysing the psychoanalysis of Frankenstein. First, we're going to create a timeline of how mental illness has been approached throughout the years.
Asylums were created in the 14th century to house the mentally ill.
In 1764, the first Gothic novel was published, The Castle of Otranto.
10 years after that, the Madhouse Act was passed, which meant institutions needed a licence to house mentally ill patients.
From 1788 to his death in 1820, King George III suffered from mental illness. He became known as Mad King George.
In 1834, the Poor Law was passed, which led to an increase in the number of asylums.
During the Victorian era, women could be considered mentally ill if they were pregnant.
7 years later, Wuthering Heights was published by Emily Bronte, featuring a mad woman named Cathy.
This is an example of mental illness in women being presented in literature.
In the 19th century, Freud's ideas on human behaviour changed how society viewed mental illness and how it was treated.
Before this, people only considered organic causes of mental illness, meaning that they thought mental illness was a result of deterioration or disease of the brain.
Psychological causes were ignored until Freud claimed that mental illness was actually a result of trauma and emotional experiences.
This led to psychiatrists researching things like early childhood traumas and their effects on mental health.
Freud proposed the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex as a way of looking at the effect of childhood experiences on mental health. Freud's theory of the id, ego and superego has been applied to the characters of Frankenstein.
The id represents unconscious desires that human beings demand, regardless of circumstances.
The superego determines which human behaviours are socially acceptable and causes feelings of guilt when an individual does not abide by societal rules.
The ego mediates between the id and the superego, satisfying the impulsive demands of the id only when appropriate and listening to the morals of the superego.
The creature is the id, as he is fueled by unconscious urges and his actions end in death and destruction.
Clerval and Frankenstein's father could represent the superego, reminding Frankenstein of what is good, proper and socially desirable.
Frankenstein is the ego. He pursues his own wishes, which causes chaos, but he still wants to protect his loved ones and face his reality.
This perspective of analysing the creature as a human mind suggests that he should be treated as a human being, not a monster.
The creature's pursuit of happiness represents the pleasure principle of the id.
Another of Freud's theories is the Oedipus complex, which describes how the male child unconsciously wishes to possess their mother and get rid of their father.
As a result of this desire, boys experience castration anxiety, which is a fear of punishment from the father.
In an attempt to resolve this problem, the child identifies with their father.
Frankenstein is jealous of his father because he represents the life of marriage and family that Victor should have.
This is seen through him pressuring Victor to marry Elizabeth with the quote, "I have always looked forward to your marriage with our dear Elizabeth."
Elizabeth essentially killed Victor's mother, as she is the one who gave her the scarlet fever.
When Victor's mother died, his sexual desires towards her were then transferred onto Elizabeth, who was then killed by the creature.
This could be because the creature competes with Elizabeth for Victor's attention.
Elizabeth represents forbidden desires as his cousin and sexual threat which Victor fears.
In Victor's dream of Elizabeth dying, she takes the form of his dead mother. This represents how his desires for Elizabeth were actually unconscious desires for his mother.
William's death represents Frankenstein's sibling rivalry as he is killed by Frankenstein's id, the creature. William is a reminder of Victor's father's sexual potency.
Before analysing Frankenstein, there are a few important points that could be made to analyse Mary Shelley's psyche.
It is vital to remember that her father, William Godwin, believed that having a free spirit and an intellectual mind was more important than religion and the laws of society.
This had a strong influence on Shelley's life, as this philosophy could explain why she didn't always follow social convention, for example using this as an excuse not to marry Percy.
Furthermore, Carl Jung suggests that individuals have a persona which reflects the expectations of an individual from society.
From Shelley's diary, it is evident that there is an incongruence between her exterior, which she tended to keep positive, and what she was actually feeling.
This led to Shelley experiencing depression.
Alternatively, Erikson's proposal of psychosocial stages mentions an identity versus role confusion stage between the ages of 12 and 18.
This is where it is important to develop a sense of identity, but the signs of depression suggest she had trouble doing this.
This is most likely due to the fact that her mother had died, and she had no constant female role model in her life.
Her father sent her away to stay with family in Scotland to try and improve her mental health, and it is here that she discovered her passion for writing, which helped to shape her identity.
These could all explain why the theme of a social outcast is so prominent throughout the text, as she wasn't accepted by society for who she was, and her inner feelings of rejection are represented through the monster.
Another similarity is that both Shelley and the monster don't have mothers or a parent they could identify with, and her exploring the effects of the development of a child.
Furthermore, this could explain why there is only male voices within Frankenstein, as she was never able to identify or learn from a female role model.
These possibilities suggest that the novel was a cry for help from Shelley.
The science versus religion debate can also be seen in Frankenstein.
In the 1800s, mentally ill people were viewed as evil and were likened to the devil because they were different to others and seen as not made in God's image.
This links to how the creature is described by Frankenstein as an abhorred devil. He was also not made in God's image, as he was brought to life by Victor instead of God.
The monster also compares himself to Satan when he says, "I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel."
By comparing the creature to the devil, Shelley takes the side of religion and could be saying that it is wrong to go against God, like how Victor choosing science over religion led to him creating the monster, who ended up killing people.
This could link back to Frankenstein originally being called the modern Prometheus, and how the story of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and being punished for eternity tells us that you shouldn't tamper with forbidden knowledge and the occult. Freud's theory of defense mechanisms can be used to analyze the characters within Frankenstein.
Freud suggested that after a traumatic experience, the unconscious may trigger these mechanisms as a way to reduce the anxiety caused by the situation.
However, these still influence the individual's behaviour.
The three main defense mechanisms that could be applied are repression, denial, and isolation.
Repression refers to the blocking of emotions and thoughts so that the individual cannot access them consciously.
For example, Victor never leaves any time to process the death of his mother, but instead moves on with his life, not allowing himself to mourn.
Denial is the refusal to accept the situation, so a person acts as if it has never happened.
And isolation is where a person separates themselves from an experience.
This is evident as Victor says, "My mother was dead, but we still had duties we ought to perform."
Furthermore, these ideas can also be seen as he separates himself from the monster and refuses to take any responsibility for it.
This is also seen when he lets Justine die for his creation, an example of his denial.
This could be because of the lack of support network at the time, which led to any form of vulnerability being a weakness and not socially acceptable.
These repressed feelings can be seen through Victor's dream, as Freud suggests we can access our unconscious through our dreams.
But he never seems to realise that the death of his mother drives the focus of his work.
Will Adams suggests that he must confront death, not just bring a creature to life, but more deeply, because he never mourned the loss of his mother. Ironically, if he could let himself grieve, perhaps he could bring himself back to life, back to an integrated existence, and to loving participation in the shared human community. Around the late 17th century, mental illness was not fully understood in society.
Mentally ill people were viewed more as wild animals than human beings, and labels such as crazy and insane became popular in describing the mentally ill.
These old-fashioned beliefs are presented in Frankenstein through how the creature is treated by anyone he encounters on his travels.
He frightens the human beings and is abused for being different, just as mentally ill people were locked away in asylums, which, until the end of the 18th century, were not humane or understanding of mental illness.
The 19th century saw an increase in moral treatments of mentally ill patients, and developments in science when people could really start to understand when people became mentally ill.
Mary Shelley could be using the creature to reflect how society needed to dismiss old-fashioned beliefs of mental illness and start to be more understanding of human differences.
Justine could also be a representation of how treatment of the mentally ill needed to be improved in society.
Justine was blamed for the death of William, and she was repeatedly said to be confused, which made her an easy target on which to place the blame.
Justine's confusion displayed signs of mental instability, and so Shelley could be using her to show how society blames the mentally ill because they cannot defend themselves.
The fact that Justine is not just blamed for William's death, but is also executed for it, shows just how important the mistreatment of the mentally ill was to Mary Shelley, and how much she wanted it to change.
As the monster is Victor's creation, he could be a physical representation of Victor's inner mind and his loneliness and mental instability.
The creature being judged and disregarded by society shows how Victor would be treated if the state of his mental health was revealed, so he hides his emotions and isolates himself from his loved ones.
Mary Shelley herself suffered from depression, so through Victor she is displaying how destructive isolation can be and can slowly lead a man into madness. Here are some examples of psychoanalysis and mental illness being shown through the form, structure, and language of Frankenstein.
There are three narratives throughout the novel, which critics have argued could be three different personas Walton has imagined for himself due to the schizophrenia he developed whilst isolated on his journey.
Walton's isolation and loneliness is seen through the quote, "I desire the company of a man who could sympathise with me." This could show why he might have imagined Victor and the monster in his subconscious to accompany him.
He creates Victor as his superego and the creature as his id, with Walton himself acting as the ego that mediates between the two. Because Walton hears the story from Victor's point of view, Victor is presented as the moral superego, and the creature is described as being evil and the id, because Victor sees him as such.
The form of Frankenstein is a novel, which is also significant as it allows Shelley to explore the inner workings of the mind through language and description, rather than separating the characters from the story and making them detached from human emotion.
Language is also used to demonstrate the structure of the personality. The quote, "The heavens were clouded," could be symbolising how Frankenstein is being shunned by God because his superego has left him and his morality has been suppressed due to him gratifying the needs of his id for so long.
The first-person narrative also makes the reader sympathise and to form a connection with the characters, and the use of letters also offers an insight into the mind of Frankenstein.
Here are some critics' quotes on the psychoanalysis of Frankenstein.
Sarah Markland. It is Victor's inability to allow himself to have less sympathetic features that result in his creation of a being that actually could act out the traits he denied himself.
Nancy Youssef. The more the creature learns about human forms of life, the more conscious he becomes of his difference.
Thanks for listening!